They threw her out on a Wednesday. They threw her out with a sack, a 4-year-old boy, and a patched dress that wasn't enough to keep out the cold of the mountain range. Welcome. If this story touches your heart, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what part of Mexico you're watching from, or wherever you may be. This is the story of Remedios Zavala, a woman who lost everything in a single morning and found something no one expected inside an oven that hadn't been lit in 20 years. Remedios's mother-in-law was named Dolores Fuentes, and she was the kind of woman who smiles in church and bites at home. She had been waiting for her moment for 3 years. What neither of them knew was that the moment would come before the boy had even learned to say his father's last name. Remedios's husband died in October. He fell from a roof he was patching on someone else's ranch, and the earth received him before he could say a word. He was 31 years old. The boy, Toms, was 3. Remedios was 27, with an empty womb that still remembered how it used to beat. Doa Dolores waited 40 days. She counted those 40 days out loud in front of her other daughter-in-law, as if she were measuring borrowed time. And on the 41st day, she walked into the room where Remedios slept with the boy and dropped the sack on the floor with a dry thud. "Your contract here is finished, girl," that's what she said. Contract, as if the marriage had been a lease. Remedios did not cry. She lifted Toms from the sleeping mat, wrapped him in the worn shawl that had once belonged to her own mother, and carried him on her hip. She picked up the sack. She didn't ask where she was supposed to go, because there was nowhere to ask about. Her own family was far away, in Oaxaca, and she had no money for the bus. What she did have were a good pair of sandals and legs that could walk. The other daughter-in-law was standing in the corridor when Remedios came out. She saw her, looked down, and said nothing. Not a word. She was just a witness. And that was the worst part, that there were witnesses. And Remedios still left alone. Doa Dolores, standing at the gate, said one last thing. "Leave the boy." "The boy is a Fuentes." Remedios didn't stop. She pressed Toms against her chest and kept walking down the dirt road without looking back, because she knew that if she looked back, she wouldn't be able to keep going. They walked 4 hours. Tom slept on her shoulder the way only trusting children sleep, mouth open, fist curled around the fabric of his mother's blouse. Remedios didn't know these roads well, this part of Michoacán, but she followed the ravine because her mother had always told her that water leads to towns, and towns lead to people. She arrived at dusk at a place that wasn't quite a town. It was a hamlet of 4 houses, a dry well, and a chapel with no door. And at the far end, nearly swallowed by thorny brush and mesquite trees, stood an adobe structure that had once been a bakery. She knew it by the oven. It was an old wood-fired oven, its stone blackened from years of use, its mouth wide as a cistern opening. It sat inside a shed that still had a roof, though the adobe on the north wall had given way. Around it, the wilderness had crept in through the windows. But the oven was still there, solid, as if it had been waiting. An elderly woman, small, wrapped in an earth-colored shawl, sat in a wooden chair beside the property gate. Her eyes were closed, but when Remedios stopped 3 steps away, she opened them. "You've got a sleeping boy and an empty sack," the old woman said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Are you hungry?" "I've been hungry since yesterday." The old woman's name was Candida. She gave no last name. She opened the gate with one hand and pointed toward the shed. "The room is in the back. No bed, but there's a sleeping mat. The oven doesn't work, but the roof does. We'll talk tomorrow." Remedios carried Toms into the room. She laid him on the mat, covered him with the blanket from the sack, and sat on the floor staring at the ceiling until exhaustion took her. That night was the first time Remedios got a close look at the oven. It was larger than it appeared from outside. The mouth was nearly 5 feet wide, and the interior chamber was deep, still smoky with a scent of old wood. Someone had built it with the hands of a person who knows how to make things that last. But what caught her eye was this. In the lower section of the oven, behind a loose brick that no longer fit flush, there was a hollow space. Not large, about the size of a shoebox. Remedios put her hand inside. She pulled out dust. She left it alone. The next morning, Candida arrived at dawn with a clay pot of brewed coffee and 2 freshly made tortillas. She sat on a stone and watched Toms, who was already awake and exploring the shed with the gravity of 4-year-olds. "Do you know how to make bread?" the old woman asked. "I watched it being made. My grandmother had an oven. Did you watch or did you learn?" Remedios paused for a moment. "I learned." Candida nodded slowly. "This oven hasn't been lit in 20 years. Not since the owner died. This property has no registered heirs in the village. Or it didn't, before," she paused. "Eat your tortillas." Remedios ate. Toms ate too. The rag doll the boy had carried in the sack sat leaning against the shed wall, watching the oven with its black button eyes. 3 days passed like that. Candida brought food and tools. Remedios repaired the north wall of the adobe with mud and stone, learned to haul water from the stream that ran 300 yards down through the gully, and began cleaning the shed. Toms helped by carrying small rocks with both hands and setting them down with a seriousness that cracked his mother's chest open with tenderness. The oven still didn't light. Remedios cleaned it every afternoon, scooping out decades of ash with an old broom. She wiped down the interior walls with a damp cloth, and every afternoon, without quite knowing why, she checked the loose brick at the bottom. On the 4th day, she found something. The space behind the brick was not empty. There was a small wooden box with a lid. The wood was blackened, but solid. Inside, wrapped in a piece of blanket cloth, were folded papers. Remedios didn't open them right away. She held them in her hands all afternoon, sitting at the mouth of the shed while Toms napped, feeling the light weight of something that had been waiting a long time to be found. That night, Candida was going to read with her something that had been locked inside that oven for 20 years. Something neither of them had imagined still existed. There were 4 papers. Candida read them slowly, with glasses she pulled from the pocket of her apron. Remedios waited. The first was a deed, a notarized property deed with a seal and signature dated 1987 in the name of Dolores Esperanza Ortega de Zavala. Remedios' eyes went wide. "Zavala?" she said. Candida looked up over her glasses. "Was that your husband's last name?" It was his father's name, and his grandfather's. The old woman went back to the papers. She read the second, a handwritten letter, signed by Dolores Ortega, addressed to whoever finds this after I am gone. The woman had written that the property and the oven were hers by right, bought with 20 years of earnings as a baker, that her children didn't deserve to inherit it because they never crossed her threshold except to ask for money, that she was leaving the property to whoever has need of it and cares for it the way I cared for it. The third paper was a will. Simple, 3 lines long, signed before 2 witnesses whose names appeared below. The notary was from Uruapan. The 4th paper was a property receipt, 1/2 hectare of land, with the shed, the oven, and space for a house. Paid in full. No liens. Candida folded the papers carefully, rewrapped them in the cloth, and placed them on top of the little box. "This woman was your mother-in-law," she said. "Your husband's father's mother. My husband never spoke of her. Probably no one spoke to him about her. Women who build themselves up alone in this country learn fast. If you say what you have, it gets taken away. The old woman looked at her steadily. This belongs to you, Remedios. You are a Zavala by marriage. You are the only heir who arrived with need and the will to care for it. Remedios felt a cold run up her spine that had nothing to do with the night air. How do you know all of this? Candida took a moment to answer. When she did, her voice came out differently, quieter. Because I was her only friend. And because when she buried those papers, I was here. She was silent for a moment. I was waiting for you, girl, not for you in particular, but for someone like you. Doa Dolores Fuentes arrived 3 weeks later. She was accompanied by her son-in-law, a broad-shouldered man in a hat with an unfriendly face, and another man carrying a manila folder under his arm who introduced himself as a legal representative without saying whose. Remedios was outside the shed when they arrived, wearing an apron, her hands dusted with flour. She had lit the oven that morning for the first time. It had taken 2 tries and half a bucket of firewood, but it caught. Doa Dolores looked at the smoke rising from the shed and wrinkled her nose. "What is this circus?" she said. Remedios wiped her hands on the apron. She said nothing. "This property belongs to the Fuentes Zavala family," the man with the folder said. "We need you to vacate the premises within 48 hours. "Do you have a deed?" Remedios asked. The man opened the folder. He pulled out a paper. But before he had finished unfolding it, Candida stepped out of the shed. And behind Candida came a man in a suit, around 50 years old, carrying a leather briefcase. "Licenciado Herrera," Candida said. "The notary from Uruapan." The attorney gave a small nod and opened his own folder. Inside were the 4 papers from the oven. Now photocopied and bearing an authentication seal he himself had applied 2 days earlier, after verifying the original will in the registry. The property was legally bequeathed in 1988, the notary said, with the calm of a man who no longer needs to raise his voice. The witnesses are still alive. The document is registered. Mrs. Remedios Zavala is the rightful heir by right of need and kinship by marriage, exactly as specified by the late Dolores Ortega in her will. The man with the folder went quiet. He looked at Doa Dolores. Doa Dolores looked at the oven. The son-in-law looked at the ground. Remedios waited. Doa Dolores met her eyes for the first time since arriving. She said nothing more. There was nothing left to say. She gathered her shawl, gestured to the son-in-law, and left the way she had come. Tom stepped out of the shed at that moment, rag doll in one hand, a stone in the other, and watched them disappear down the road without quite understanding what had just happened. "Did they go?" he asked. "They went," said Remedios. The boy nodded with his usual gravity and went back inside. Something in Remedios's chest stopped hurting. When spring came, the smell of freshly baked bread reached all the way to the main road. Remedios had rebuilt the north wall of the adobe with the help of 2 men from the hamlet who agreed to work in exchange for bread each week. She had set a long table inside the shed and 2 wooden benches. She had planted a small orange tree beside the gate, which already had 4 green shoots pointing toward the sun. The oven lit every day from 4 in the morning. Remedios had taught herself the measurements because the papers in the little box had been written in the margins, in small, careful handwriting. Dolores Ortega's own times and proportions. 2 hours for egg yolk bread, 1 hour and a half for crusty rolls, 40 minutes for piloncillo cookies. Tom's was 5 now and could count to 20. He liked to sit beside the oven and watch the bread rise, with the rag doll resting on his knees. One morning in March, Sandita arrived later than usual. She was carrying something wrapped in brown paper, a deep crimson shawl, new. It was hers, she said. She left it for me to give you when the time came. Remedios took it. She unfolded it carefully. It smelled of cedar and of thyme. Why me? She asked. It wasn't a complaint. It was a genuine question. Candida looked at her with the expression of someone who has lived long enough to know that some things aren't explained, only received, because you arrived with a child and a sack and didn't ask the heavens for anything more than a roof. That's what she prayed for, that someone like that would come. Remedios folded the shawl over her arms and breathed slowly. Sometimes the most desperate moments are not the end of the story, but the first page of the one that truly matters. Sometimes God doesn't send what we ask for. He sends what we need to find, and He hides it where no one else will look. Dolores Ortega hid her papers in an oven because she knew that only someone who intends to do something with an oven will ever come to one. And Remedios came. Hungry, with a child, with hands that didn't know how to give up. Has a door ever opened for you unexpectedly, when every door you knew had closed? If this story touched something in your heart, leave your comment down below. Tell us where you're watching from and what part of Remedios' story moved you most. Give us a like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single story, turn on the bell, and share it with someone who needs to know there are still doors left to open. Until the next story, a heart-to-heart embrace. Toms pressed his cheek against the warm adobe of the oven and whispered, to no one in particular, it smells like home, Mama.